Good morning or afternoon to everyone, depending where you're beaming from. And thanks a lot for joining us for an hour of panel discussion on what we think is another hot button topic, all flash. My name is Winston Thomas, Editor-in-Chief for CDOTrends, and today we will be discussing making the all-flash data center a business reality, a CXO perspective. We created this panel discussion in partnership with Pure Storage, and who is also our kind sponsor today. So why all flash? There are several reasons. One of the major pull factor is that the technology has changed, a lot more features, and these have altered the economics. There are also push factors like ESG and sustainability drives, as well as governments like Singapore and Australia pushing data center owners to improve efficiency, reduce energy usage, and reduce wastage. There are also lots of technology reasons. Boom in AI is creating a headache for storage guys, especially when tape-destined historic data now needs to be accessible and available on the fly. And now we are talking about recoverability and resiliency. These are hot topics coming out of the pandemic that every company is focused on. So the business case looks stronger, but is it? What's stopping companies from immediately jumping on the all-flash bandwagon? And what happens to the technology debt when you do? These are questions I will not be answering. I'm just your moderator today. We do have an esteemed panelist who will be looking at this from different perspectives. So let me introduce them. First, we have Dr. Peter Wong, Chief Technology Officer from Prenetics. Then we have Nolan Kam, Managing Director for Singapore at CR Partners. And lastly, from Pure Storage, we have Ben Singh, Client Technical Director for APJ. A couple of housekeeping rules. This discussion is not just about us. We want you to be part of it, joining. So please use the Q&A button, not the chat button, but the Q&A button right at the bottom of your screen to ask or send in your questions. I would like to kindly ask to make sure the questions are topical, and I will be moderating them during the discussion. Lastly, this discussion is done under Chatham House rules, so please do not attribute any quotes to the speaker itself. Now, let's start the discussion flowing, and I'd like to try and start with a very generic questions. The question here is, all flash benefits are clear. Lower cost, high performance, there's lots of ESG benefits. So what's stopping decision makers? Maybe I would like to start with Peter. Peter.
Hi, Winston. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. So a little bit of background from Prenetics, right? So from a technology standpoint, we're looking at doing healthcare through genomics testing and other types of testing to provide information to our customers with a very specific focus in oncology. So early detection all the way to treatment. Now, all of this tests and services requires a lot of data analysis. And we actually run data analysis for sequence data from genomic test. These sequence data, we're talking about large amounts of sequence data. When we analyze them using a hybrid infrastructure. And so when it comes to data storage and data access, read and write, we always looking at how we can optimize that. Because at the end of the day, if we're doing things like oncology, looking at cancer detection and things like that, patients and customers do want to have this information as quickly as possible, because it is actually affecting their lives. So when we're looking at how quickly and efficiently we can process those data, becomes very important. And so this is where all flash storage comes in, where we're looking at opportunities there where we can reduce the latency, make it more scalable, reduce the footprint of our infrastructure data center. So we have on-premise and cloud. So we have a hybrid model. So we want to look at that and also reduce power consumption, right? Because there are less moving parts. And these kind of properties are quite important for us when we are processing big data, terabytes of data at a time from sequencer. So definitely from our perspective, we're looking at that. But then of course, cost is one of the things that a major driver on what we use, and also what we already have in our infrastructure. When we do migration, there's obviously a cost to that.
So Peter, just wanted to look at what you have mentioned. You've talked about data access in terms of latency is very important. I'm sure when you're talking about data, we're also talking about unstructured data when it comes to actually analytics. And then you're talking about performance as well. So the question is, what's keeping you on the sidelines, or what's making you think twice? Is it cost at the moment, or do you see there are other issues that you want to think about before moving off both your two legs onto the all-flash bandwagon?
I think this is where we're looking at the requirements from the business, from the customer, and a lot of it is to do with how we do the migration if we're doing the migration. So there is definitely a migration cost. We already have the infrastructure in place. We have the data centers. So we're also not considering just perhaps all flash, but for example, like a hybrid model where there is a tier model on where we're using flash arrays as a cache layer, for example. So that is actually a possibility. I think right now is looking at where that might sit from that model. So we're definitely looking into it, but I would say that the decision is not yet of whether it's all flash or whether it's a hybrid.
Okay. Nolan, what about yourself?
That's a very interesting question. My name is Nolan. I'm from CR Partners, and I lead the technology practice in CR Partners. So among the clients that we spoke to actually in the last 6 months, I guess what we do observe is the fact that the spend since post-COVID has gone on the upward trajectory, although there's a slight blip in the last few months, but we think the trend is largely intact. And that trend is driven by a few factors, right? So there is a strong demand for organizations that are trying to refresh their data centers today. And we do see that a lot of them are trying to balance, using on-prem services versus the cloud. And you see a lot of work and effort going into hyper-converged infrastructure. And that's where the all-flash arrays actually make a lot of sense, especially as what Dr. Peter Wong has shared. A lot of the customers are actually using this sort of infrastructure to support their analytics requirements. And one of the more emerging trends that we have seen today, and it's also on the back of CR Partners' work in generative AI, some of the clients that we have been speaking to, when it comes to them pursuing their generative AI programs, we do notice that quite a number of them are looking at building their own generative AI platforms on-prem, right? And that is on the back of very obvious issues when you try to use SaaS services like OpenAI, and there's a lot of concerns around putting the data out on the cloud. We have that experience. So in many of our conversations, it's really about how you build the platforms on-prem. Most of them, especially the corporates, the banks, they have a lot of data, right? And that is where they have this concern where I want to do generative AI. I have a lot of data that I want to train the model. We are seeing that quite a number of them have been driven by this to relook at their architecture. Hence, hyperconvergence is coming into the picture, Flash is coming into the picture, because they really need to have the platform that could support the high IOPS that is required to train some of these models. So these are some of the factors that sort of emerged in the last few years, and I'm sure that the other moderators will talk about costs and so on. Those are holding people back, but the push factor, the demand is certainly ramping up.
That's very interesting. So you mentioned especially Gen AI. How has Gen AI sort of changed the equation when it comes to looking at storage? Is it the data access that, or is it just pure the amount of storage that's needed? What is pushing them?
So Gen AI itself, it's a fairly wide topic. I won't be able to cover it entirely here. But what I can say is for the models that you see today, using ChatGPT as example, right? They're essentially models at the back, and you can find a lot of these models online, open source. There's a website called Hugging Face. It's quite popular. What the model needs is really data for you to train on. So for organizations trying to implement their Gen AI use cases on-prem, where there's an additional component that a lot of people are building. It's called vectorized database. So that component itself, it's where you are going to be throwing in a lot of data for you to be able to pre-train the model for Gen AI. And that's where you see a lot of you need quite a bit of a high performance infrastructure to be there. So that is actually that particular component is the one that's driving the demand for now.
Thanks. Ben, from what has been spoken and talked about, what are your perspectives?
Well, if I look at the game changers in the storage market, the biggest one, the one that's picking up the largest amount of press right now is the move to QLC. Between lifespan of TLC and where we're at in QLC, we've got quite a few more density cycles to go through. So just in the last couple of months, we're seeing announcements for modules, individual chips getting twice the density in QLC. Now, QLC will give us the opportunity to drive better density in the data center. It'll give us the opportunity to reduce the cost of storage. We'll begin to reach that point where we cross over NL SAS versus flash. The closer we get to it, the bigger the question is, do I go look at a spinning disk, or do I look at a high density flash so I get consistency of access? And then from there, we're going to come back to restores. What's the corporate recovery time objective? Everybody talks about backing up and how much data they can afford to lose, but no one thinks about which systems have to be recovered first. Prioritizing your critical systems so that business can return to normal operation. I believe that QLC will create a lot of opportunities for businesses to address business continuity in a different way, disaster or corruption or hardware failure. It'll give us a lot more options to solve that problem that aren't going to necessarily wreck the budget or cause implementation issues, because at the end of the day, it's still storage. It's a medium that we're already familiar with. We're not introducing a fundamentally new technology.
When you talk to clients, you mentioned QLC and TLC and the old MLC as well. Do people actually talk about this right up front, or is it something that you have to bring it up to actually explain what has changed, what has improved? Go ahead.
Well, for the most part, customers aren't aware of this. You have to bring it up because the first question they're going to ask is, well, why is this cheaper? It's a different technology. It's got a different access time. It's not necessarily for your prime time core transaction processing platform, whether it be banking or your Oracle RAC platform. It's aimed at something that it's a bit slower. And customers have always have been conditioned for a long time to believe that flash is always fast. We're now leaving that reality. Flash is going to have performance tiers just like disks used to have. We had 15,000 RPM, we had 10,000 RPM, we had 72, we had 54, and then we got SSDs and all the rules changed. The same thing's happening in flash. Now we've got multiple layers within the flash and different speed targets for each one of those. And in addition, because the density is higher, we have a different price point for each of those. And yet the power is about the same to power the chips.
That's true. Peter, I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned earlier on in terms of all the push factors from Prenetics to actually look at all flesh. Now, what is the one thing that will move you forward? Is it going to be the density, or is it the efficiency, power efficiency? That's one of the things that you actually answered just now.
So I think from our perspective is really looking at, I think it's the overall picture. There is no single factor that will determine whether we will switch. I mean, if you think about, we run these sequencing, next generation sequencing constantly. We run sequencing a lot on a daily basis, right? And so when data comes off, we process. And if you're just looking at that, then any sort of migration will have to take that into account. If you're migrating from an existing production pipeline, from an existing infrastructure, the infrastructure, does the infrastructure currently allow this kind of storage to be installed, for example? So that's something we need to consider. And of course, the time it needs to actually migrate, because obviously, what do we do with existing data? So if we keep the existing data in the existing infrastructure, then it becomes a hybrid model, because there will be time where we need to access data from both sides as well. So that's something we need to consider. And of course, like what Ben said, then there is also, we need to think about also backup and storage, and also failover, right? Resilient. So how do we prioritize our workload so that when we have a situation we need to actually recover from a disaster recovery perspective, which one do we look at first? Because we run multiple pipelines, and so that's something we need to look at. Now, an interesting thing about actually from based on Roland's perspective is that on the generative AI side, there is actually a lot of interest also from our side to look into from looking at providing services to our direct to consumer customer, health oriented services, looking at prevention, looking at giving advices, looking at how we can train our model to understand more about our customer, so that we can build that model and say, so we can provide personalized recommendations from a healthcare perspective. So again, we're exploring that. There may be an opportunity there where we can go into using all flash technology to look at that piece as well.
Ben, I'm just highlighting what Peter has mentioned quite strongly, actually, for the last two times, is in terms of migration. How do you actually tackle? I'm sure that's a question that you face when you actually talk to a lot of clients. So I'm just wondering, how do you actually approach that from a pure storage perspective, as well as all flash?
Migration. I'm going to say the same thing Peter said. It depends on the system. Different systems have different requirements. If we talk about the classics, Oracle RAC, yes, we know we're going to use the software to move that. If we talk VMware, again, we're going to have VMware do the heavy lifting. But when we start getting into more exotic forms of storage, like object-oriented storage, now that's not an easy option. So it depends on the system. I can tell you that we can implement operational migration, whether that be through mirroring and cutover, or we can do disk-based migrations, or we can do NAS-based migrations. But there's not an easy answer to this. And every time we talk to a customer about moving from whatever they have today to whatever they want to go to tomorrow, if it's not within the pure ecosystem, we have to talk migration. And I haven't had one customer where one size fits all.
That's true, and that's true for a lot of things. Nolan, I'm just curious, with the clients that you work with, is ESG and carbon footprint a big topic for them?
For most of the clients in APJ, yes.
Sorry, Nolan. Go ahead.
Yeah, indeed, you're right. It is increasingly a very big topic among our clients today. I think the push is really the regulatory pressures that you probably have seen both in Singapore as well in other parts of the world, driven largely by the IFRS Foundation starting up ISSB and the eventual adoption of the reporting standards. Is starting to have a material impact according to the clients that we had spoken to. I had in fact spoken to one of the largest data center operators in Asia with a footprint in UK. And we were actually helping them on their ESG strategy, and it's weighing heavily on their mind, not just as a way for them to report to their shareholders and their boards, but it was what I could say for now, a requirement as part of their listing. So I will leave it at that.
Okay, that's interesting. Ben, you got a comment to that? Good.
When we talk about ESG, ultimately we're talking about power consumption as the #1 item. So when we talk about data centers, ultimately we're talking about power consumption and heat dissipation, air conditioning. It's all the same thing, it's power. So optimally, we want to be aiming for the highest amount of storage or performance in the smallest amount of space, requiring the least amount of power draw. And I know the performance and the power draw, not exactly a good match if you look at the way processors are rated, but that is the target.
Peter, you mentioned also performance and power efficiency are also important. How do you actually balance them when you actually make a decision call?
So this is where as mentioned, we have a hybrid infrastructure. And so looking at things like power consumptions, looking at the cost of running the infrastructure, I think there's a balance between heavy workload versus, so we don't run just long running workloads, right? We also have transactions that we process. And so this is where we make trade-offs and saying, well, for short running transaction bursts, and we can actually distribute those transactions, then they should be running on the cloud. So we use storage services for those data, for example. But for long running transactions, we tend to keep that on premise, because then we don't necessarily need to. First of all, we already have the infrastructure. So from a OpEx standpoint, we continue to have that. And also a lot of this downstream analysis are more, these scientific algorithms are less. It's not as simple or it's non-trivial to actually have it distributed. And so when we look at how do we balance that in terms of cost, in terms of environment, ESG, we're really looking at this approach where we're splitting these two, and then trying to optimize it from a ESG, from a power consumption perspective.
Okay, great. Just wanted to highlight to everyone, please be part of this conversation. We have a question on the Q&A button, so thanks for that, Clarence. I also like to invite everybody else to just chime in with your questions. Just keep it topical, and I'll moderate them and pose to our three luminaries on the virtual stage. Now, I'd like to hit on the question that Clarence has asked online, which is basically looking at balancing new demand and the maintenance of old systems as one of the biggest challenge. I like to veer towards the maintenance of the old system, which is basically talking about technical debt, and that being a challenge. I'd like to ask Nolan, how much is technical debt an issue when making decisions on storage?
The short answer is it's a significant challenge. Echoing Ben's point that it really depends, but what I've seen in the past, where you have very complex environments and you're trying to keep those complex environments running, for the business, it by itself, it carries a certain technical risk, right? And that risk is not just in terms of the operational or the total life cycle cost of the infrastructure, but also security risks. So what a lot of organizations fail to consider is they just look at the TCO, and TCO is important. It's the number one question that we get from CIOs and what CEOs always ask. What's the TCO of your legacy versus me buying a new one, right? And that's the big question that is always on the top of decision makers. There's also the security side of things in running the legacy environment, and you will have to factor that in that decision. We have seen it happen. We have seen technology adoption because something bad happened from a security standpoint due to the aging infrastructure. So all these are factors that one should consider when making that decision or preparing that business case to the C-suite when they want to do a tech refresh.
Thanks, Nolan. Ben, you want to weigh in to what Nolan was mentioning?
I can think of a lot of circumstances where I've seen this happen. To Nolan's point, the CIO sees it as a sunken cost. He's got the system on the ground. He doesn't have to spend more money. The thing is, it's 4 years old, approaching 5. 5 years is that magic number in hardware land where everything gets ridiculously expensive. In addition, they're not updating your code base, so you're stretching out security vulnerabilities. And then the one that no one likes to talk about because, again, I already own it. I want to use it more. Well, what happens when it breaks and you can't get parts? Or the parts and the code don't match. Now you got to do a code upgrade to put in the part because it's a later version of the part. You're introducing a level of operational risk to the running business. This is what is not shown in a TCO. You have to be able to explain to the business, this platform, this piece of equipment has a lifespan of, depending on infrastructure, it's 5 to 8 years. This is the lifespan. If we stretch past this, if it goes down, this is how long it's going to take for me to replace it. And it will take down these critical business systems. And the business has to accept that risk or look at other alternatives, which would be replacing the platform.
Ben, from pure storage perspective, not trying to ask for a plugin, but you do have the forever subscription. So how does that work out, or what's the uptake for that? Because that actually addresses some of the issues that we've been talking about.
We can upgrade all of the chassis that are in the field right now from one generation to the next non-disruptively. It's very straightforward. Yes, there might be some code increases during the way so that we can accept the new hardware, but think about leaving your storage in place and then installing a new controller. And since we're not fully active, we run at 50% on both sides. That means you're not even going to take a performance hit for this. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and say that all of our customers run their controller upgrades in the middle of the day, but it has happened in select customers. I wouldn't expect to see anybody in a critical business situation, such as banking, volunteering to do that, but it has happened in the field.
Thanks. Peter, how much is technical debt an issue for you at this moment? Because you've been running a lot of the hardware for quite some time, and basically Prenetics has grown over the years organically. So I'm sure you will be having a lot of these challenging issues right now.
So there's always a constant challenge to manage technical debt from things that are grown organically, as you mentioned, from our last few years working a lot. We came out from our COVID business where we done a lot of testing for the Hong Kong community and the UK community. We primarily used a lot of cloud infrastructure at that time. With oncology, now being our focus, there's a lot more on-premise infrastructure. So then you add in not just the application legacy, but also the infrastructure legacy. As Ben was mentioning, some of the servers do have their wear and tear. The storage do have their wear and tear. And interesting enough, when Ben mentioned about what happens if there's an issue with them, the parts won't be available. I have my personal experience also with that. So it is not is something that we have to deal with at times, and of course with the business expanding through acquisitions and investment, we are bringing a lot of heterogeneous setup, into our stack. And so one thing we're doing right now is actually, at least on the application level, we make it as consistent as possible from for example, cluster management, using if I talk about application, talk about using things like microservices, using Kubernetes to manage those service operations. We even trying to use that to manage our bioinformatics pipeline. So what with that means that we can even try to fail over that onto the cloud if there's an issue on premise, for example, for time being. So we have a quick failover while we're trying to recover whatever has happened on premise, for example. So there's that, and of course then adding to that is time to. When we think about it, at the end of the day, also we think about time to market. How do we make sure that we have that, we are focused on that piece as well. So I think that's quite, those are the importance.
And you mentioned that you're growing by acquisition. So you're actually also bringing in other technical debt, right? So basically you're trying to extract it and put it at the application layer to make sure that you manage it, and then you're keeping the infrastructure layer apart. Having said that, how have you changed the way you actually work with the cloud players? Because you mentioned there is a huge reliance on cloud players when it comes to storage or data storage. So I'm just wondering, have you changed the way you approach cloud players? Do you actually ask for flash storage with your cloud players? Does it go to that level yet?
I mean that is a conversation. It's an ongoing conversation. I think right now, so for data backup, so for data protection, privacy, and also as of course for control as well, for the IT control as well. Data needs to be, we back up our data for a number of years in cold storage, and of course with data protection, we need to be able to access that, such that if individuals want to have that data removed, right? So we have to build that pipeline, and doing that on premise has an issue where you don't have the scale because there's only so much physical space. So then we have to do a lot of that backing up onto the cloud. So we do use the cloud for a lot of that also. But as I mentioned before, right, we actually run a lot of transactional services on the cloud as well. So right now, when we do a lot of these acquisitions, we have a lot of different, obviously, office organizations as well. So the companies themselves are different. They operate differently. They use different stack, and so a lot of the work's now spent focusing on aligning that business processes, aligning that infrastructure, aligning those applications, so that we can actually reduce the complexity. Because as soon as you have another company joining, you increase that complexity immediately. So then you think about how you can bring that together. So a lot of time spent actually, and post-COVID is looking at that piece, working with different organizations within the group, and looking at their infrastructure, looking at their applications, and see how we can align, at least from an architecture standpoint, have a consistency.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah. Nolan, a question based on what Peter has just mentioned. Infrastructure alignment. We have been talking about infrastructure alignment for the last 25 years. We're still trying to get it right, but that's always an interesting equation that always seems to be right out of our reach. But having said that, how many people do actually consider storage when they talk about infrastructure alignment right up front, based on how you are approaching your clients? Or is it a conversation that you have to bring it up right up front?
It would depend largely on the maturity of the clients that we speak to. There are clients that are fairly mature in their enterprise architecture practice. They are fairly mature in their engineering practice. So when we do broach the topic of infrastructure alignment, we can have an honest conversation, right? We can really talk about your compute needs, your storage needs versus what you need on the business side, and we can therefore design a strategy that works for them. And that really speaks about how you can optimize what you need with a combination of on-prem as well as on the cloud services, because I don't think it's going to be fully on-prem for anyone nowadays. It's always going to be some form of hybrid. The trick is trying to align the business needs versus some of that proportion between what you're going to be using on-prem versus on the cloud. And of course, on-prem, the type of transactions and business applications that you're using that would require and would demand the need of all-flash type infrastructure. So I think that conversation will depend on maturity. So far, for the large enterprises, banks, and so on, the FIs in Asia, the big ones are fairly confident of a strategy. The mid-sized ones are the ones that we do have quite a bit of conversations with them to try to sort of get them to think about some of these considerations and put together a framework around it.
Thanks. Ben, when we talk about storage, infrastructure alignment, how do you get into the conversation in terms of making sure the storage is also aligned with infrastructure when they talk about big picture infrastructure?
I usually ask the customer how the business, what weighting the business puts on the criticality of each application. Because if you talk about it from a storage perspective, it's irrelevant. But if you can talk to the customer about which applications generate money, revenue, and keep the customers happy, that's going to be your core platforms. And those are the platforms you'll benchmark the overall infrastructure off of. Of course, you're going to have outliers like backups, which are irrelevant until you need them. But those are going to drive it. So you'll end up with three, maybe 4 tiers typically. That's of online storage. When we move to offline, it's an entirely different discussion, because that can range from the cloud to tape for those people who have been unable to divorce that medium. Some even go as far as to go optical. At least optical is more stable than tape and storage.
It's true. Nolan, back to you. And I'm looking at a question on cloud failover, especially cross-border cloud failover. Is that a challenge that you see with your when you speak to your clients as well?
I would say China will be a unique entity by itself. So even at the business level, most of the clients that we do speak to that have operations in APAC and by the extension operations in China, most of them adopt a China for China strategy, right? Where to the extent where their infrastructure are literally segregated between the China mainland and the rest of APAC. So when I'm trying to recall one particular instance that we were helping a client to design their shared service infrastructure across APAC. For China itself, we literally had to carve out a separate Azure zone just for them, just for the China business. So when we do the failover, it's likely to be within the country itself, and that's just also partly driven by the regulatory requirements for data residency. So that's a huge piece of work that is ongoing. All the banks knows pretty well the regulations that has just came online 1st of July from CAC and so on. So it's one of the key drivers for you if you have business in China, you're building your infrastructure or cloud in China, it will have to take into account all of these regulations.
And Peter, is that a consideration for yourself? Because you mentioned UK and in Hong Kong, but I'm sure you're looking across the border elsewhere. But is there a concern in terms of cloud failover in mainland China?
So we for mainland China, I think in my past experience, the understanding is always we keep that separate, right? We in mainland China, if you look at cloud solution, for example, they have different regions, so you could always fail over to different regions. So you can apply that same methodology inside mainland China. I would say that we obviously had operations. We have operation globally outside China, and I think if I go back to the time when we did a lot of the COVID testing back in 2020, especially for the UK, when we started that for the English Premier League, when we did testing for the 20 clubs, so they can start their football match again. We had to actually move our infrastructure to the EU because there is a data residency concern. So moving from Asia all the way to EU, and because we were using cloud infrastructure, so it was very easy. We practiced something called infrastructure as code. So everything was able to just move across. We took 4 days to actually set that up, everything up, and to have them start testing there in the UK. So I think using that kind of technology to allow us to do cross-region failover or to migrate failover is quite important. And I think it also applies within mainland China as well when you have multiple regions.
I guess infrastructure as code with Kubernetes is what you are talking about, but that's interesting. Yes. Ben, any thoughts in terms of looking at cloud failover when you considering China with its own residency or sovereignty issues, based on your conversation with clients across Asia?
Data sovereignty comes up on a regular basis. It's not isolated to China. It's not isolated to Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, Korea, Indonesia, Kuala Lumpur, or India. The list keeps growing. I've had that talk many times, and we've actually had to set up instances in more than one country specifically over data sovereignty. I don't see it going away. There's a few organizations that have the benefit of being able to move their data set out. I've seen a few banks exploring consolidated storage with remote key management, but it doesn't seem like the traction's going anywhere on that. I don't think the regulators are going to allow the data to leave, even if the key is held in country, even for backup purposes. Now, this is a bigger problem for Hong Kong and Singapore than it is for most countries. Hong Kong being a city-state, Singapore being a country city-state. It's a large challenge around data sovereignty. Eventually, they will need to find a place that they feel safe storing their data, but I haven't heard of anything yet.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, coming back to on track, on especially all-flash. Ben, you mentioned right up front that all-flash, not all flash is the same. There's different layers. Could you explain more in detail how is it not all the same, and how is Pure Storage any different or different?
Well, all vendors are offering TLC. Some are still even offering SLC, oddly enough, but we don't see that very much. What's interesting is only a handful of vendors are offering QLC. So that's the first differentiator. Pure offers QLC. We're first to market. What's more interesting is the way we approach Flash. Most storage vendors out in the storage industry offer it on SSDs. As common SSDs, you could literally order one from Newegg or Amazon tomorrow and get the same drive that they put in a storage array, minus the microcode. Pure's taken a different path, and we've decided to build our own modules to optimize the density and optimize the power, and most importantly, no longer use the data abstraction layers that make a flash module look like a hard drive. That's wasted tiers of abstraction, wasted block level formatting, etc. It's not required. At the end of the day, we're trying to store bits and bytes onto a flash medium, and we want to recover it quickly. In addition, Pure does, we already do our own garbage collection. We're not using standard firmware for a garbage collection. So that translates from a user perspective into a lower failure rate. One of the more interesting things that was done initially at the build, we put compression and encryption in from the beginning. So Pure is arguably a third-generation storage platform. If we look at the more modern platforms, we're not scale out like the original big boys, Hitachi and EMC. We're scale up, but we're also built around, we're not built around microcode anymore. We're built more around software. So that gives us a flexibility. It allows us to be more nimble in terms of security. It allows us to add features quicker. It allows us to manage our storage directly. And we can adjust to protocols in a more timely fashion. We don't have to go out and build a whole code stack specifically and then set out the ASICs for our individual controller front ends. This is the thing that gives Pure the greatest flexibility. If I had to cite something specific from a software perspective, when ransomware got out of control, Pure, in the space of 6 months, implemented our safe mode offering, allowing us to lock data and protect it from destruction from an administrator or a hacker or even a data overrun where you encrypt all the data. We're able to set that snapshot aside. That was set up and running from a basic feature on month 1 to a full featured set in 12 months. And they're still refining that as we speak. Most vendors just couldn't move that fast because of all the different layers and the history of the code and the interoperability.
Thanks, Ben. Nolan, Ben mentioned in terms of failure rate, as well as now ransomware, especially when people are going after your backup storage. How much is that a big concern with clients at this moment? Or are they just getting awareness, or is it a difference of maturity within the company?
It's a question of maturity within the company. I think for organizations that have a on-prem setup for quite a while, they do know the necessity for them to replace their disks on a regular basis, right? That's a given, because there are mechanical parts, they fail, and if we are familiar with the MTBF cycles, we know that the failure rates would definitely go up within the next, well, after the 3 to 4 to 5 year mark. That's going to grow exponentially. So if the organization is fairly mature, they would typically build in the SLAs, and they would make sure that in contracts that they have, if they are having a colo data center somewhere, to make sure that there is some protection coming from the loss of data on the disk.
And keeping to the topic, we are talking about a CXO perspective. Does this kind of decision come to a board level? Is that a consideration, or is it still a technology topic?
I wouldn't say that it won't come to the CXO's attention, but it would depend on the CIO being smart enough to address this topic in the context of TCO, right? Most CXOs will not be approaching the board to say that, let's go and replace this, right? That's not going to be the conversation that they're going to have. But what the conversation they do make with the board when they request for budgets is really around, one, what if we don't replace the disk, if we don't replace or refresh our infrastructure, what could be the business risks, that they will be facing, right? So it's on the risk dimension. The other conversation that they would typically do is from the cost dimension, right? If you don't do this, the projected TCO and running costs is going to go on an upward trajectory, right? And that's going to impact the budgets in the subsequent years. So usually with these two arguments, that's when you can start to get into the details of a transformation or a tech refresh program.
Peter, is that a similar conversation that you're having with the board when it comes to refreshing your storage?
Again, based on what Nolan said, and I echo from what Nolan said, is about you're not going to go in to talk about renewing storage and things like that. You're looking at the overall cost, you're looking over a budget going from it is the running cost, it is the headcount cost, it is the what the business needs in the next quarter, in the next 12 months or so. Then we look at can we sustain that, or do we need to grow and scale out? Now, if we need to increase and grow, then the question is down to, wait, can we use this opportunity to actually start this hybrid model, right? Can we start this opportunity to actually, if for the next thing we launch, let's use the flash technology, use all flash, or use the hybrid model at least, so that we can actually start building out that new infrastructure, and also retiring at the same time the old ones. It's going to be a bit of a transition, right? If we have that opportunity.
Thanks. And Ben, how are you helping people like Peter and Nolan to actually empowering them to talk to the board?
There's two approaches to this. One's operational, one's financial. From an operational perspective, the biggest thing you need to describe to the board is lifecycle management. And it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's going to depend on the platform and the category. Laptops will have one cycle, servers will have another cycle, and then heavy infrastructure will have yet a third cycle. That's something that has to be agreed with the business based on a risk profile. Now, there's going to be exceptions to that. There's always an exception to every rule, but that's the starting point. The second phase is actually going to be how the business plans on paying for things. Do they want to capitalize? Do they want to OpEx? Do they want to outsource? These questions are key as well. So there's always a concern around maintenance and support costs. And if the business views that as too large of a risk profile, maybe they need to look at OpEx.
Interesting. We're coming to the end of our discussion. I think we've had this discussion and it seems to be going on, and I think we can have another 1 hour of discussion, but I think at this moment we have, in terms of time, end this. But I would like to ask now each of our panelists to actually talk about the key takeaways from this discussion. Maybe we can start with Peter. Peter, what are your thoughts after this discussion so far?
I think this panel actually also, for myself as well as sharing, is also being able to learn from Nolan and Ben, obviously from understanding the from a provider perspective and from the market perspective of what other industry, what other CXO looks into from that perspective. So I think the key takeaway from myself and from our organization is, when we make these changes, we need to looking at the business needs. The technology is definitely a good thing to use, all flash, regardless it's all flash or hybrid. Definitely something that we should look into. But I think it's capturing the opportunity at the right time to make that change, so that we can benefit from that latency, from that low latency, from that scalability, as well as reducing the power consumption and the actual physical footprint, and then be able to prioritize our failover as well, and invest into new applications such as using generative AI. So that to me is the takeaway.
Thank you, Peter. Nolan, thoughts?
I agree. This session has been quite useful for myself to understand the perspective from Peter, notably a user of the technology, as well as Ben, who is providing the technology. I think the key takeaway for me here is the fact that there's a lot of promises about all flash over the last 5-6 years, right? I think we have reached the inflection point where the technology and the economics increasingly make sense for people. And from the demand side, we are seeing that push to accelerate, both in terms of refreshing the infrastructure post-COVID to new needs like generative AI. So I think this is a topic that is worth watching.
Thanks. Ben, last thoughts? Are we at the inflection point, or have we passed it?
I think we're at the inflection point. A lot of people have been looking at a 20% deviation, treating that as a financially relevant number. They won't be treating as financially relevant when they have to migrate off that NL SaaS, and it takes 3 weeks. We're at the inflection point now.
Okay, that's great to hear. First of all, thank you, Peter, Nolan, and Ben, for joining this discussion. I think it has been really quite lively and engaging. We looked at a lot of topics. I think we veered slightly off topic as well, but we came back to it and we actually went deeper in terms of this having a CXO perspective. So really thanks for a lively discussion and all your insights. And to the audience, thanks for joining us. Please look at the screen at the moment. You see a QR code. Now, we really want to hear from you as to how we have done so that we can tailor our leadership series as well as our future events to what you want and to your liking. So please do scan the QR code and just fill in the survey, and we'll like to hear from you. It's just a short survey. I think it takes like 10 seconds of your time. With that, I would say thank you. Thank you for joining us. And I would also like to thank our sponsors, Pure Storage, for making this happen. And we hope to see you again for our next leadership series. Stay tuned, where we will be coming out with the next topic. Thank you, and have a good evening, afternoon, or late morning.